because I have astigmatism.
Okay, hello and welcome to Access. My guest tonight is my very good friend, a great American, and a prize-winning documentary producer, Victor Tice. And Vic is here tonight to talk about why he joined the Communist Party in the 1930s. All right, Vic, why did you join the Communist Party in the 1930s?
Richard, to understand that, you have to understand that I was born into a different world than we've had in this country for the last 40 or 50 years.
Right. When
I was born, America had not yet entered World War I. The Russian Revolution hadn't taken place.
Really?
The Kaiser was still on the throne in Germany.
Right.
I remember when I was 10 or 12 years old, we call them Decoration Day parades then. In the Decoration Day parades, there were lots of Civil War veterans. I mean, it was a different world, and you have to understand that that was the world in which I...
And there was a depression, too.
Well, I was about to say that then when I was 12 years old, there came this crash, and you have to spell it with, like in a comic strip, with great big C-R-A-S-H, because when I was not yet 13 was when the stock market in October of 1929 did have this terrible crash. And after that, people were so desperate. Well, let me give you a couple of examples. We now are suffering in this country from 9.8% unemployment.
Right.
During the Depression, the Great Depression, 25% unemployed. Incredible.
Probably more.
Well, maybe even more.
Yeah.
People were so desperate that, let me tell you about a couple of examples of desperation. The bonus marchers. What happened was that the veterans of World War I had been promised a bonus. In fact, in every American war, there's always been a promise of a bonus after the war is over. And by 1931, there was such desperation in the country that the veterans began to form an organization to go to Washington and to demand that the bonus be paid then to relieve them of their hunger, of their privation, of their inability to feed their families. So I think something like 47,000 veterans and their families went to Washington, D.C. to demand that the bonus be paid at that time. And they set up what they called Hoovervilles along the banks of the river there.
Hoover was president then.
Hoover was president, right.
Yeah.
And from the dump, they got pieces of whatever, and they built a camp, and they laid out streets, and they have a very strict discipline, no drinking. They would even have parades every once in a while to keep order, make sure everybody was happy. And they kept on petitioning Congress to pay this bonus. Well, instead of getting Congress to pay the bonus, President Herbert Hoover ordered that they be driven out. So the police tried to drive them out, and they resisted. Whereupon Hoover ordered the army to drive them out, and you had the sight of the American army with their bayonets affixed to their rifles, marching on these people who had come to plead for a bonus to relieve them of their terrible suffering, and the army drove them back, and finally the army stopped and burned all the encampments. And at this point, Hoover began to get a little bit nervous. It didn't look good. And he ordered the army to stop, but General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of this group, in charge of this army activity, with his aide, General Eisenhower, and Patton, they literally drove these veterans out of Washington, D.C. And it just shows you the kind of desperation that people were facing.
Well,
there.
How did this affect you, Vic, and your family, to get you 5 years later to decide to join the party?
Well, this all happened in 1932, but here I was. I was now growing. My teens were. I was advancing into my teens, and there wasn't a day that went by that didn't again demonstrate to me how desperate people were, how terrible conditions were. And also, see, at that time also, there was the example of the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia. Now, the reports we got from Soviet Russia, including in the New York Times, the reports were of full employment, factories being built, farms being established, everybody working, everybody fed and clothed and sheltered, everybody with medical care. And to me and to tens and hundreds of thousands of other Americans, especially young people, because it was kind of a romantic notion, here we had what was going on in the United States as a result of the Wall Street excesses and the capitalist crash. Here we had in the Soviet Union, communist Russia giving this example of wonderful things happening there.
Well, of course, that didn't turn out to be the case. I mean, that you had the example of the peasants in the Ukraine who didn't want to be collectivized, and by the tens of thousands, they were sent to Siberia. You know, you had the purges in Moscow in the 1930s, where more than half the presidium of the Congress was arrested.
May I interrupt?
Well, I'm almost finished. You were executed. This news didn't get through here. Is that what happened? Because it was an oppressive regime.
I'm sorry that you introduced that note at this point, Richard. I really am.
Well, but you introduced the note. You said that there was this reports of this paradise in the Soviet Union, and the reality turned out to be quite different.
Actually, the reality didn't turn out to be quite different. The reality was really a sort of a mixed message, because on the one hand, they did have incredible growth in their gross national product, incredible growth in the things that people had, incredible growth, not growth, but they had full employment. They did have medical care. They did have housing.
Right.
They did have education. So that you're right. But this, of course, only came to people like me later.
That's what I'm asking you.
I'm sorry you introduced it now.
Well,
let me tell you why I'm sorry.
No. You're sorry I introduced it. I thought it was important to introduce it because we need to understand that a lot of people here were deceived by these reports from the Soviet Union about it being a workers' paradise. And I'm sorry, Vic, I have to bring that up.
I guess what I'm trying to do is to emphasize how, for those of us who joined the Communist Party, the reports were so glowing.
Right.
For example, I'll give you another example. The second highest clergyman of the British, the Anglican Church, the Dean of Canterbury, Dean of Canterbury Cathedral. The Dean of Canterbury Cathedral wrote a book called The Soviet Power. He'd gone to the Soviet Union and spent a lot of time there, and he came back and he wrote a book with a couple hundred pages in which he described in detail the wonderful things that were going on.
Yeah, a lot of people felt that, yes.
And so that's why I think I want to emphasize for the listening audience that it's critical to understand that it was a different world, a world that was dominated by the terrible things that were happening in the United States. And what we thought at that time, with some reason to believe it, were good things that were happening in the Soviet Union. I had a friend who was 15. I was 15 at the time. His father was an unemployed bricklayer. The Soviet Union paid for him to come over to the Soviet Union to work there because they needed workers.